Salt and Sanctuary, a 2D action role-playing and pumpkin-wearing simulator developed and published by Ska Studios in 2016. At first glance, with its unassuming aesthetics and seemingly straightforward premise, it may appear deceptively simple. However, as I delve deeper into this thing, I was pleasantly surprised to find that this game possesses a soul, nuance, and a very mature restraint, trusting the player to discover things on their own terms and even better, at their own pace. You'll often see this one described as some sort of weird offshoot mutant child fusion of a Dark Souls and Metroidvania game. The developers initially intended to combine the combat of the Dark Souls series with their previous dishwasher titles, while taking inspiration from the free-roaming exploration-based design of your Castlevanias. The gaming ecosystem at the time was filled with some straight-up bangers, with the releases of titles such as Doom, Stardew Valley, Far Cry 4, XCOM 2, Dark Souls 3, and a personal favorite of mine, the Blood and Wine expansion. I gotta be honest, Salt and Sanctuary was not on my radar at the time, and it could have remained that way, but this game has garnered a respectable cult following, riding the wave of the 2D platformer resurgence. Ska Studios was founded by James Silva and best known for developing several indie titles with a focus on 2D action and role-playing. Now, I have not personally played other Ska Studio titles, so I can't speak to them, but it is easy to see the influence their previous aesthetics and general vibe had on the development of Salt and Sanctuary. Indeed, Salt and Sanctuary seems like a natural, and you could say ambitious, progression for the studio. Salt and Sanctuary was a seemingly significant game for Ska Studios as it marked their debut on the PlayStation 4. The development of the game took about 2.5 years, and the small size of the team meant that some cuts had to be made to the original game's design. However, the game received positive feedback from players and critics alike, and its success helped establish Ska Studios as a player in the indie industry. Now, the studio hasn't provided specific sales figures for Salt and Sanctuary, but according to the developers, they've said it sold, quote, super well on the eShop and Steam. While Ska Studios is keeping quiet on specifics, SNS was one of the highest selling digital games on the eShop in certain weeks, and it's no surprise that a sequel was announced in June 2021. Critically, the game did very well, with IGN giving it an 8.6 and many reviewers praising its successful combination of Souls-like elements translated into a 2D space, while more negative reviews focused on how the game did little to separate itself with a unique identity. Mitch Vogel from Nintendo Life was quoted as saying, "Salt and Sanctuary does an admirable job of hitting all the right beats that it needs to provide a challenging and fun action-adventure that will no doubt provide a solid bang for your buck, but it doesn't do a whole lot to stand on its own two legs. All told, Salt and Sanctuary is just about what you'd expect it to be. It's more or less a 2D Dark Souls." Now, gentle listeners, you may have heard me say the trigger phase, Dark Souls, more than a few times in the short amount of time since this video has started, which is just as upsetting to me as it is to you. As a gaming content creator, I always knew the day would come where I would have to emerge from my anime and RPG bed covers and at least mention the dreaded name of Soulsborne in a whispered and choked voice, but for this game there is simply no way around it, and so I will nip it in the bud and do my best to discuss it right here, right now, so we all may move on. Now, to be frank, the comparison to Dark Souls comes as no surprise, as the game was baked from the very start with this DNA, and they wear it proudly on their sleeves. And this isn't a bad thing at all. Taking the aspects that work, stamina, refilling health, no map, abstract story, interconnected world, especially when the theme of the game ties into these mechanics, which most of the time they do. Looking at you, map. It's actually amazing in a way, and a testament to the strength of these mechanics that they translate at times so seamlessly into a 2D space. However, there are varying degrees of success here. We'll talk about this more, but in particular, the combat probably suffered the most with these conversions due to the simplicity required to make it work here, losing a literal dimension. And for everything that was imitated, there is a fair amount here that is distinct, even if they could be seen as minor details. Death has been reworked to be slightly less punishing with the addition of another currency, which you don't lose on every death. Another big departure is the skill tree leveling system, reminiscent of Path of Exile, which deviates heavily from the Souls leveling system, for better or for worse. There are some moments that I kind of sighed and raised a jaded eyebrow at: giant guardians in a castle, messages left behind by players, and I think the biggest one was this mimic chest encounter, and I wish there had been at least a little bit more done to not so obviously be referencing, because after all, hey, I've already played Dark Souls, I don't need to play it again. James Silva acknowledged the comparison, saying, "Paying homage to Souls-like while still finding our own voice was a critical challenge. I looked at ways games exist on a common landscape. Incredibly inspirational games like Dark Souls, Castlevania, and Ninja Gaiden Black existed alongside our own, The Dishwasher, and Dead Samurai." So yes, the Dark Souls DNA is in there. It's a core tenet of the game design, and we'll talk about it more in depth later, but despite all of that, I'm going to try my best to come at Salt and Sanctuary straight up and value it on its own merits, not compared purely to Dark Souls. While sometimes this may be difficult, I think the game succeeds at being its own thing, and it has its own voice and story it's trying to tell. Okay, that's all great, I hear you say, but what the heck is this game even about? Well, my dear listener, let me explain. You play as an adventurer who has been shipwrecked on a mysterious island. Your objective is to find and rescue a lost princess who is supposed to be married off to a neighboring nation's king to prevent a war. A really cliché and generic objective that for the dark setting might have you thinking, that's maybe a bit suspiciously generic. As you explore the island, you encounter a vast array of enemies, including bandits and beasts, and must fight numerous spooky bosses to progress in your quest. Story at first seems a bit bare bones and can lull you into a false sense of security with the generic Save the Princess quest. If you take time and scratch beneath the surface, you start to see that there's much more depth and nuance evidenced by the item and enemy descriptions, as well as names of bosses. As you delve deeper and deeper into the island, it becomes apparent that something might not quite be right. Your original objective seems to twist and sway as you discover more about the island itself. The game excels at cultivating a growing sense of unease as you traverse through different and varied landscapes. The story allegedly had its origins in A Song of Ice and Fire, with a great emphasis on House Greyjoy, with themes such as drowned gods, blessings of salt, and that cold, morbid philosophy, what is dead can never die. Heap on top of all of that strange medieval plague-esque aesthetics and, dare I say, Lovecraftian influences, and you got the primordial soup of this game's general vibe. I think the beauty of this type of setup is that it works to satisfy different player types. If you're into immersive stories, you'll probably love piecing together the clues and uncovering the island's secrets. But if you just want to hack and slash your way through the game without worrying about the plots, that's totally cool too. You can absolutely ignore it all. The game treats you as an equal in this way, and in that vein lets you decide how best to approach, and that includes how much you want to engage with the story itself. It really is a nice celebration of player autonomy, and this is reflected in almost all other aspects of the game, which ties it quite nicely all together. After character creation, we are quite literally thrust into the game with the wafer thinnest of all explanations about who you are and what you're doing. We find ourselves on a ship tasked with delivering a princess to another country in order to secure peace through marriage. However, things go quickly awry when you realize that the ship has been attacked in the middle of the night. In a nice detail, you can actually catch a glimpse of the princess and her handmaiden aboard the ship. From the onset, you're left with a lot of questions. Where are they taking the princess? And where did the journey even start? The game leaves a lot of these details up to your imagination, so you can come up with your own theories and ideas about what's happening, which is a nice slap in the face to make you realize you're going to have to figure things out for yourself. Immediately, if you do a little digging, you can actually get a little backstory into your character depending on the class you choose. There's a suggested backstory based on your armor and equipment. The knight may be a low-ranking noble guarding the princess, while the mage is likely an initiate in training. The chef is probably the cook on the ship, and the thief could possibly be a stowaway. As we fight our way to the deck of the ship, we are confronted with the first boss of the game, the Unspeakable Deep, a massive sea creature that attacks the player with a variety of tentacles and explosive projectiles. Adding to the chaos, the fight takes place in a dark, murky environment, which makes it even more challenging to dodge its attacks. You're more than likely going to get your ass handed to you your first time fighting this guy, but fortunately for new players, it's not really necessary to defeat him. In a nice nod to the Vanguard Demon in Demon's Souls, you can actually beat him, although it'll take a lot of patience, even if the movesets are somewhat predictable. Either winning or losing, the outcome is the same, and the ship goes down. We wake up on the shore of a strange island, and with only one way to go, we venture deeper inland. The shore is a really nice visual contrast to the dark and oppressive atmosphere of the boat from the previous section, and oozes this surreal, dreamlike vibe. When I first saw it, it kind of made me sit up straight and say, this might just be an interesting game. The typography and design of the UI, although easy to see their inspirations, works really well to just bump up the general atmosphere. Walking a little ways up, we stumble upon this old guy who has maybe one of the best greetings I've ever received.
Say what?
I can't tell if he's talking about the character or if his derpy little eyes are peering past my in-game avatar into the depths of my very soul. Aside from talking mad shit, he does serve a gameplay mechanic, which is the game assigning you a creed. It's notable that the game engineers a more memorable moment to decide this mechanic, as they could have easily just thrown this into the character creation, and this hints that this decision might carry some weight. On the other side of the creed, we find our first sanctuary. These serve as the havens where we can chill out, level up, and even get a variety of vendors and other NPCs that add special bonuses to each section they are in. In a nice touch, these are pretty customizable, with the aforementioned NPCs, but also depending on what creed we choose. We'll talk about sanctuaries and creeds more in depth later, but just to clear the air, I want to go on record and say there is a very apparent absence of leveling waifus, very sadly. The first honest-to-God level we get is the Festering Banquets, and it serves as a nice appetizer. Okay, sorry. A nice appetizer for what you're going to be in for. Gruesome and brutal atmosphere filled with generic and spooky monsters? Check. Mysterious and oddly specific names for places and enemies? Check. Looping level design with optional and secret areas? Check. It's a really nice intro that strikes a nice balance between being forgiving but also challenging enough. The scale of the level is actually pretty surprisingly large for a first level, but the shortcuts we unlock along the way give you a really nice sense of progression. The Sodden Knight is a very challenging but fair intro to the mechanics. You got to watch for the multiple patterns that sometimes change but are telegraphed well once you know the tells. It's a solid tutorial boss that doesn't hold your hands, and you get the impression that the devs really wanted to put their best foot forward here, and I think they succeeded. It also helps this guy is an absolute unit of a man, a bit chunky, He was apparently once a martyred hero, and he just has this great intimidating vibe on top of this forlorn tower, and it's just a very nice intro to this beautiful and desolate island. The Village of Smiles definitely is reminiscent of some other places we may or may not have been to, but it does make a very memorable first impression. The traps are going to be a reoccurring theme in the game, and I guess I do enjoy how over the top this one is, even if it's kind of a gotcha moment. I can practically see the devs behind me giggling with glee as my poor guy gets absolutely decimated by this comically sized tree. It's also the first instance of the game really nudging you in the side and hinting there might be something more going on here than just your typical rescue the princess scenario. I was honestly really shocked the first time the crucified man talked to me because he just blends in so well with the rest of the gruesome atmosphere. The boss for the area just has such an interesting design and looks like something out of a terrifying Dark Ages kids book about hell. Usually I would think a name like Queen of Smiles is, I don't know, a bit too much, but the atmosphere of the arena and the design of the model just really sell it, as well as the way she just rushes at you in this chaotic, terrifying way. It's just great. Maybe I'm thinking too much into it, but it's also maybe another hint of the mockery of the saving of the princess genre trope, and is preparing you that this world is gonna be a bit darker. She's also got this very messed up backstory where she became the ruler of a kingdom through a wedding alliance, and she slowly went insane, decorating her walls with smiling, impaled corpses, eventually getting murdered by her subjects, who cut her jaw off to give her an everlasting smile. Oof, the lore, man, it just hits. So you may be naively thinking, wow, this sounds like a great game so far. But unfortunately, we start to see some of the cracks starting to show with the Watching Woods section. It's not really a difficulty spike, but more of a test of platforming and poison mechanics, which are not this game's strong suits. I think probably a good 80% of my deaths in this game were from jumps, and most of them came from my first playthrough in this section. The small platforms don't give you a ton of room to maneuver, and one false step and you're instantly going to die. It doesn't help that some of the more mobile enemies' physics are completely insane and twitchy, and they can jump across all of the goddamn map, and by the way, run into you as you're jumping, causing you to fall and die instantly. This would be bad enough, but then you run into these blob guys who inflict poison damage, and they stole that annoying grab mechanic from Dark Souls where if they touch you, they instantly grab you. But some of these touch hitboxes activate at the slightest bump, and it just leads to this annoying and seemingly unfair experience. If you aren't part of the Stone Roots Creed, you'll get your intro to them here. They are also known as wood wraiths and tend to be skilled in alchemy and working with poisons. And maybe a nod to this, we get the Alchemist boss battle, which seemed a lot easier than the past bosses, but maybe that's just because I was a bit more used to the game at this point and finally found a two-handed sword, which allowed me to roleplay as Guts. I do think that this boss is kind of a tutorial on how to deal with a lot of chaos in the boss arena, but if you stay focused and don't panic, it's not that bad to get through. This game is really great at keeping you on your toes with new mechanics or situations, which, given the limits of 2D, is pretty impressive. This concept is brought to good use where at the very first section of the next area, we are thrown into a boss battle, which my first time completely threw me off guard, and I noped the f*** out of there. It also helps that the spectacle of this boss is this great, huge black mass with this crazy red eye that just towers over you. Once you get over the initial panic though, his moveset is disappointingly slow and forgiving, so it's really not that hard to get through, which is nice because if you're coming from the Watching Woods like I did, the journey of the boss is absolute hell. At first, my interest was piqued when I realized that this was the second Kraken we encounter in the game, and it made me go, wait a minute. A Kraken and a Cyclops. How can a Kraken be a Cyclops? There are some questionable enemies here that kind of materialize out of the environment, and this was kind of hinted at in the Watching Woods with the poison blobs, but you could at least see them if you were looking closely at the trees. To be fair though, these enemies only emerge in certain areas, so you can learn to be wary around columns. The False Jester is the second boss in this area, and again, I was a bit taken aback at how quickly I ran into another boss in the same area as the last one. Fortunately, this one, at least for me, was pretty easy, as I kind of just got into this habit with my massive two-handed sword character to just wait for an attack, roll behind, hit again, and rinse and repeat. The idea is kind of interesting though, because apparently this is a Kraken masquerading as a jester, which makes you wonder, like, why? Shortly after, we run into the real jester, who gives us our first real brand of the game, which is the first kind of Metroidvania-style key to unlock new areas. The upside-down mechanic is actually pretty interesting, and when utilized best, it really forces the player to view levels in a new light. Unfortunately, this doesn't really get utilized too much, which turns out to be a common theme with the brands, and there was one section in the Red Keep I straight up just ran into a dead end because I think I ended upside down in a place I wasn't supposed to go. Okay, so by this point, some of the observant among you might have started to see a bit of a theme of drowning and the sea. And so, at this point, I've been doing my best to avoid spoilers and talking too much about the story of the game. I feel like if you haven't played this game, you should have gotten a decent idea of the vibe we're in for here, and no shame at all if you click out and want to experience it for yourself. So I'll wait for it. On that note, I would also like to thank Asuku13, I hope that's how you pronounce it, who wrote the Drowned Tome, which is kind of like the Bible of the lore for this game and must have taken an ungodly amount of work, so big shout out to you. Okay, now that those losers are gone, the next major area is the Castle of Storms, and it immediately made an impression on me as being visually distinct from the rest of the dreary maps that we played. The castle is huge and imposing and is always in this perpetual night. Now, listen, as I said, I'm trying very hard not to bring up Dark Souls too much, but this is very, very reminiscent of Anor Londo down to the giant guards. What's that saying of being a fine line between imitation and flattery? This section is really when I started to think about the game's scale, as the castle just seemed to go up and up, and I think the design really makes you feel like you're in a completely different locale from previous sections, and this is no coincidence. There is a lore reason why all these varied swamps and villages and castles, all with their own unique cultures and stories, are next to each other. These are real places that originally existed outside of the island in the broader world, but have been mysteriously whisked away, complete with their inhabitants. The Castle of Storms, in fact, should be somewhere in Caucasus. In fact, to quote the Drowned Tome, quote, "It's heavily hinted upon that there is someone, or something, taking places from the mainland. The enemies here are more unique and challenging than those we faced before. Sorcerers who cast a variety of magic at us, the aforementioned giant sentries, and even nimble assassin types that all really ups the scale, and it all seems more combat focused than previous platforming type levels. To cap it off, we have a huge difficulty spike and easily one of the hardest bosses up to this point, the dragon. I feel like this boss, on top of the giant enemies in the castle which drop 1,000 plus salt, is the game trying to tell you that this is where you need to level up. And in my first playthrough, that's exactly what I did, but I think in doing so, I ruined the next few hours of gameplay because my first run was with my Guts character, who after being leveled appropriately, could just pretty much out DPS almost everything he came across for the next 10 hours of gameplay. I think the worst thing about this boss, and to some extent many of the other bosses, is that you have to play very reactively. So for example, you are kind of at the mercy of whatever move the dragon makes. If it flies up and spews fire at you, you gotta drop your plans and run like hell. I know you could probably say this of like any boss fight ever, but I think the best bosses are when it feels like kind of a rhythmic dance, where at some points you take initiative, and at other points they take the lead. For example, in Bloodborne, right, you can parry Lady Maria and take the initiative back here. And yeah, I mean, you can technically stagger this boss and many others, but I feel like many players who don't run strength builds might struggle with that. After struggling through and finally taking down the dragon, who, least I forget to mention, is also a goddamn kraken, we are awarded with another brand, which initially I was very excited about, which is the wall jump. But again, it gets used very scarcely and almost never in combat, which is a huge shame. The game does really open up here and has many different branching paths, all to seemingly very different locations. It's a testament to how big this game is, and I always felt like if I was stuck somewhere, there was always somewhere else I could explore. With the Red Hall of Cages, we're again back in Spooky Lands with a dark and foreboding labyrinth of torture chambers. Maybe because everything kind of blends together, but this section feels absolutely enormous to me, and the shortcuts were a huge relief. The level 2, like many of the sections in Sultan Sanctuary, feels incredibly oppressive, with most of the screen being completely black except for these tiny ominous red glows along the pathway. This section felt like a pretty big difficulty spike again, and I felt very out of my element here. And I think a lot of this is due to the absence of landmarks, with the walks from the sanctuaries being absolutely incredibly long until you know where to unlock the shortcuts. Every section of the game does a pretty good job of bringing unique enemies that fit the environment thematically and sometimes gameplay-wise, and the Red Hall is no exception here. The reskinned minor enemies have heavy armor detailing that they used to be guards or torturers here, which is a nice touch. My greatsword playthrough, I would just kind of turn off my brain and swing my giant sword at enemies, and most of the time the problem would solve itself in a torrent of blood. The Heartseeker enemies finally made me turn my brain on again, as they have no attack themselves, but make the nearest enemy to them invincible and force the player to approach combat encounters a bit differently. On the negative side of things, we have the Hanged Men. The idea and design behind these is pretty impressive, but their execution is a bit rough. Their major flaw is that they tend to just hover beyond your reach, making it difficult or impossible to attack them, and seen as the only way to interrupt their extremely intrusive spell is to attack them, it's no wonder these guys get so much flack. The devs may have figured as much, and kind of with a shy grin and eyes downcast in mild shame, they almost never appear in the game again. But save your raucous celebrations, because later in the level we meet the infamous Tree of Men. I will say he is extremely memorable. The first time I saw his janky little legs, I thought it was just hilarious, but my grin quickly left my face when I realized those cute little dancing feet could one-shot the shit out of me. To its credit, it's an interesting and unique design, both visually and mechanically. However, the mechanics, although distinctive, focus on this game's weak points, which is platforming, and specifically platforming in combat. I'm going to save a lot of my thoughts on the platforming for later in the video, but I will say here it amazes me that the devs did not use this opportunity, one of the only vertically focused bosses with an emphasis on platforming, to use the wall jump ability we just unlocked. Like The Alchemist, this match forces you to keep track of many different things at the same time, some of which can insta-kill you, which is why I think I see a lot of people draw comparisons here to the Bed of Chaos. It really is a shame because this is one of the few, maybe one of the only bosses where platforming and vertical mobility is actually utilized in the boss fight. But due to the ease at which you can get thrown to your death, this one gets a bit of a bad rep. One great thing about Sultan Sanctuary is the feeling you get that you're always going deeper and deeper into darker and more alien areas where you feel increasingly out of your element. Every level I kept thinking, wow, this must be as deep into the bowels of the earth as we can get. And then we go into Haggar's Cavern, which, by the way, isn't even nearly as deep as this game goes. The visual design here is interesting and does enough to separate itself from the other dark cave-type levels we've been into. And it has this motif of shipwrecks mixed with alien, glowing growth in the background. This map is one of the few times the upside down power is used to great effect in the level design, and it forces you to have a perspective shift on your goals and navigation. So all that is good and dandy, but now we gotta talk about the Bony Boys. They are kind of like these jumpy archer enemies from earlier in the game, but much worse because they are so persistent, like they follow you all over the map. If you decide to fight them, strap in for an exhilarating experience. I think if the devs needed to have a teleporting enemy that can cover the entire goddamn map in a second, these guys would have benefited from a slow wind-up animation so you could at least hit them before they playfully skidded away. Before I realized there was a shortcut, these guys made getting to the boss an absolute nightmare, especially on the platforming section, because you can't really run past them and fighting them is so tedious. So yeah, not good times. Disemboweled Husk is surprisingly fast and hits like a truck. It's a challenging match that forces you to stay mobile to avoid the pistol shots, and then when you get close, he can swipe at you with his sword. For a generic undead pirate captain fight, I think the mechanics are pretty good, and it was good to get back to a more human-sized enemy that felt more like a duel and a dance. He can get very frustrating though when he decides to get trigger happy with his pistol, and you get the feeling that the pistols maybe should have been a little bit slower or less far-reaching. The Mire of Stench. I really do try to be objective and critical, but I gotta admit my bias when I have one. I just don't understand the hard-on developers have for poison swamp areas. It's not original, it's played out, and this one is no exception because on top of dealing with poison again, we have to deal with very questionable platforming. Aesthetically, it's not super interesting or different from the Watching Woods either. It's nice they started to use the wall jump a bit more, but these sections were a bit frustrating for me in implementation. Listen, I didn't have a great time playing this one. If you did, more power to you, but it's just not my thing. Also, what's not my thing is the stench most foul. Trying so hard not to mom joke here. This one lacks engaging mechanics or even really a significant level of difficulty, making it a very mundane experience. He does have a very brutal backstory though, as he was apparently made by the Wood Wraiths who worshipped him until his appetite grew and it ate them. So in a way, we're killing a god and a religion here. On the other side of the Red Hall of Cages, we get treated to a long atmospheric walk through a beautiful night sky, giving you the feeling of going to an entirely new world, and in a way we kind of are. In the past, the Dome of the Forgotten was recognized as the Dome of Light, a sacred location where all devotees of Devara's light were welcome to gather. Over time, an inquisition was launched to stop the spread of sin and required 3 sacrifices. The lore really matches the art style, and it comes at such a contrast to the dark and dingy places we've grown used to seeing in the game so far. Navigation-wise, it's also kind of relief from the sprawling labyrinth levels like the Red Hall of Cages. The invisible enemies are really obnoxious though. There's kind of a way to see them, but I realize these guys actually float, so their movements are just very unpredictable. Although you can use Undersight to see them, as I mentioned. There are 2 bosses here, both with wildly ranging difficulties. The Untouched Inquisitor is so easy. I mean, it's just an objectively easy fight. He floats around the arena without a care in the world, and only really has one very easy attack to dodge. It's a bit of a shame because based on his lore, this was a bad dude who was responsible for a ton of deaths, so you'd think he'd be more of a tough hombre. What? So you think he'd be more of a tough hombre? You think he'd be more of a tough hombre? Oh my fucking god. Oh, Jesus Christ. You think he'd be more of a tough cookie, how about that? However, what he lacks, the third lamb more than makes up for. He used to be a pet that guided and protected pilgrims at the Dome, but the Inquisitor deliberately left him nameless and broken because he saw names as sinful. His lightning attacks do massive amounts of damage, even if you wear the best lightning equipment you can find, and he can turn on a dime, making not even his backside safe. He also just has a massive health pool, which again I think is geared more toward DPS characters. After taking out the bird,
Bird up.
we got another brand, this one even more niche and situational than the other powers we have. Basically, when we see a shimmering light, we can take out our torch and turn those lights into platforms. This is a pretty unexciting power, at least I found it to be. One annoying thing about this is the fact you have to use torches for it, and therefore taking out an equipment slot, and the fact that the area of effect here is pretty small and finicky sometimes. I tried to grab a ledge on more than one occasion on these light platforms, only to have it disappear and me holding nothing but my dick. The Ziggurat of Dusk feels absolutely massive, and I think this was done in a great way where we can see the scale of it from the outside and explore all of the inside. It just goes seemingly down and down and forces you to loop around and explore every nook and cranny from different perspectives, and makes use of the different brand powers, which can easily confuse and disorient you. It's filled with tough high-end enemies, including the Knights, which are an ever-present threat on the island, equipped with a variety of different weapons and movesets. After taking out the Dried King, which for me was a pretty forgettable fight as my Guts character, but was a surprisingly lengthy affair for my Dex character, we get a chance to talk to the Black Sand Sorcerer, who further throws doubt on our original goals to save the princess. He tells a suspiciously similar tale to our own journey, and even more disturbingly, he mentions, quote, a demon that feeds off the ruins of nations, a demon that collects. Such a powerful being could dwell on this island, or perhaps this island is the demon, and it feeds, claiming men, women, kings, countries. This use of NPCs to bestow brand powers I think is a particularly effective one because it ties gameplay mechanics, world building, and our characters' journeys together. A lot of these NPCs actually are recurring characters and have their own little stories which weave throughout the game world and can easily be missed if you aren't careful. The brand he gives us is the ability to dash jump, and although I'm amazed it took this long to open up such a basic ability, this does allow for much greater mobility. I'm honestly happy this exists at all, as in my first playthrough by this point I had resigned myself to the possibility that there might not be any movement upgrades whatsoever. With the Dart brand, we are finally able to access the Bloodless Prince. Now, he may seem like a bit of a brainless giant type, but he's actually maybe the only one on the island, aside from one notable exception, who has managed to subdue the Krakens. He achieved this by creating the clay hybrids, by sealing the creatures' heads in clay masks that bear his likeness. In a nice touch, these guys actually protect him down here. Visually, he has an exceptionally compelling design, and I love that you can't see his face, and it's just obscured in this darkness and mass, but I found this to be another very easy boss fight. Again, it's strange, we just got the dash jump, but it's not used at all in this fight. I found my tried and true strategy of just rolling behind and attacking was just as effective here as it had been for the previous 10 bosses. I do always get a kick out of enemies that kind of belly flop attack you, like, I don't know, it's just a combination of anger and apathy that I just really relate to. There is another creepy scarecrow boy after the boss fight, again reminding you of the greater threats, and with each meeting he divulges a bit more information to us, and we get a better understanding of his mindset. Basically, he doesn't come off as the happiest of fellows, you could say. Howl's shit. I mean, Mal's floating castle is an optional area that I bet most players are going to miss on their first playthrough. Hidden levels like this are always such a great inclusion and add so much replay value. Getting to the castle requires some backtracking after you got your new powers. It's quite impressionable getting there, but a bit disappointing that the visual design on the inside is just kind of the same generic castle interior as on other levels. It's a short and sweet little area filled with some useful farming spots and items with its own unique boss, which is a nice touch. The Ruined Temple is a wide open level with plenty of breathing space for the player, and it requires us to loop in and out of other neighboring regions, which is a nice reminder that these locales are smashed together and all interconnected. The Thing of Arms are a particular notable enemy type that, although are just kind of a reskin of medium-sized enemies, have a kind of funny mechanic where they yank off one of their arms and just casually, in an almost resigned manner, chuck it at you. The Ruined Temple is another location that at one time existed outside the island. It was constructed on Markdor with the intent to showcase the strength of the Mountainsmiths, which is another creed in the game, and coincidentally the creed I rolled with for my Guts character, as it seemed most appropriate for him. I love how the sanctuary design for these guys is very Game of Thrones inspired, even if it is a bit on the nose. Anyway, the Ruined Temple was later defiled, possibly by the Coveted, and it serves as this area's boss. It's a very creative boss fight, but also considered by some to be one of the hardest bosses in the game. The axe serves as the boss, and the ghost axe simps are impervious to damage. They alternate between wielding the axe itself, while the other one hurls magic attacks from above. And I gotta say, these guys have some pretty incredible aim. It's kind of a play on the multiple boss mechanic and another really unique design. It's actually one where I genuinely had to switch up my strategy and really take my time weaving through attacks and waiting for openings. It seems like a lot of people struggle with this boss, and I can see if you were playing a bit more tanky, slow build, the magic attacks would be pretty devastating and difficult to dodge. The Pitchwoods is one of the optional areas in the game and serves as the capstone platforming test for the entire playthrough. Through your efforts, you can unlock a secret creed, the Keepers of Fire and Sky, who are very magic focused and one of the kind of secret ones. It is unfortunate that you need to advance so far in the game to unlock them, because they really are great for mage builds. The Salt Alchemantry is another level that really stands out aesthetically from the rest of the game, and you can just tell by the name itself and the design of this place that it's going to be important from a lore perspective. It has this interesting mad laboratory art style and crazy cackling noises every once in a while, which when I first heard really freaked me out. It also includes new mechanics with the tubes, but doesn't go crazy with them for better or worse. These last few levels are definitely intended for higher level characters, and the enemies here are particularly difficult, including the Alchemantry Knights, who will absolutely ruin your day if you aren't being careful. I really like how this game forces you to pay attention, and even the basic enemies can pose a significant threat at these later stages. On the story side, Salt Alchemantry itself is essentially manipulating the power of the sea by using salt. This enables one to fashion dreadful creatures that are bound to their creator. It is described in-game as, quote, crafting the sea itself, poison with life force of a myriad of souls into abominations of twisted design. Order allows life to cycle through the sea with birth, death, as threads in the grand tapestry of oceans. Salt Alchemantry is an unnatural perversion of this order. This place is run by two twin sisters who serve as the back-to-back bosses for the areas. The Architect and the Unskinned is another multi-boss fight, and their attack styles really complement each other pretty well. While the Unskinned is your typical frantic, big angry boy who charges and swipes recklessly, the Architect floats gracefully above the chaos and casts AoE spells that effectively block off portions of the arena momentarily to the player. This can lead to some pretty frustrating moments if you aren't careful where your character is, and if they are reliant on mobility and rolls, you can effectively be screwed if you try to dodge one of the Unskinned attacks by rolling into an area that's currently being magicked by the Architect. This leaves very little time to land attacks. I have no problem with some builds being better or worse depending on the boss, but but I will say this game seems like it might be too much the case here. Towards the end of the game, some bosses have extreme resistances to certain types of damages, which is probably why giant two-handed weapons in this game seem a little bit OP. While these guys are tough but fair in my opinion, in the preceding section we are confronted by the Witch at the Lake, who is the aforementioned sister of the Architect, and you'll pretty often see her listed as one of the most difficult bosses in the game. I think this mostly stems from the fact that she has a couple moves that will absolutely ruin your day and stunlock you to death. On top of that, she's also incredibly mobile, and I just find it so frustrating with these flying bosses how limited we are when it comes to vertical mobility ourselves. So basically, we just have to plod along after her as she flies gleefully around, casting insta-death magics. The Crypt of the Dead Gods is one of the last standard levels the player will encounter in the game, and unfortunately for me, the visual design was a bit forgettable, giving us another standard dark generic cavey type environment. This is unfortunate as this section, and really many of the final few, including the Salt Alchemastery, have a pretty large significance to the story and world overall. The bland aesthetics also match the level design, and it feels like maybe the devs either ran out of time or ideas here, as the layout is just kind of blocky and straightforward. True to end of the game form though, the standard enemies here will absolutely decimate you if you aren't careful, and actually have effective counterattacks if you roll behind them, which is a genuine rarity in the game. I completely missed the Three Kings in my first playthrough, and it was really nice on repeats stumbling on new content even this late in the game. I'm sure most players will easily miss a few bosses or areas, and it's always nice when the devs are confident enough to trust the players to find hidden content. Interestingly enough, these guys actually have pretty massive lore implications. The Three is one of the other major starting creeds in the game, and seemingly the most prominent religion on the mainland, although it's unclear how the gods being down here impact the outside world, if at all. There are some very dark and interesting implications that the Three may owe much of their power to the ruler of the island, which we can see in some item descriptions. Quote, "A divine blade wielded by the Forgotten Knight. Once symbols of justice and courage, this now decrepit sword and its former owner lay abandoned and powerless in the crypt of the dead gods, even as the faithful continue to pray for their guidance. For how long this farce went on can only be guessed, but it would seem that those prayers were being answered instead by the dark forces at work on this forsaken island all along." End quote. It's even more interesting for the fact that the player could potentially have had the Three as their creed this entire time, and it's fascinating to think that this is a very dark concept for you to stumble upon the decrepit and corrupted remains of your character's literal gods in this world. I mean, if your gods got this messed up on the island, what chance do you have? The other boss in the area is Kraken Dragon Skurs. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but anyway, he's responsible for the destruction of your ship and probably all the other shipwrecks here. As the second to last mandatory boss, he's, as you would expect, a pretty tough fight and is goddamn huge, seemingly taking up a good quarter of the arena. His attack areas are equally massive and require a good amount of precise movement to dodge. I did feel a small bit disappointed that it's essentially just another huge monster enemy type where you can just roll behind to win, and I feel like the devs were really reaching the limitations of the types of bosses they could implement with the character's limited moveset. Although it has to be said they did a damn good job of coming up with creative designs. The last area is the Still Palace, and here in a nice cycle, the old man from the start of our journey who turned out to be the king of the Castle of Storms is here. This is basically the expedition dump of the game and your true identity as an eternal being who has succumbed to death by drowning is revealed. The island functions as a limbo state, existing between life and death, and serves as a destination for those who are lost or otherwise deceased at sea. The being responsible for this is greedy and hungry, collecting souls and locations in hopes of becoming a candlelit soul. Earlier in the game, it's possible to meet a mysterious NPC who claims to be a candlelit soul, although it's never definitively explained what this actually means. This nameless god uses the Krakens to collect those from the outside world, and once on the island, the nameless god uses their memories to recreate those places from the real world. As for the princess, she might have been real from one of the various realities, but it's very likely she died since you can find her clothes on the islands. And on a side note, there's actually evidence to suggest she might have been a slave. Talk about dark, man, Jesus. The deep lore here ties into theories on one of these secret creeds in the game called the Order of the Betrayer. Basically, they worship one of the old gods. I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this. Azraq. I'm gonna go with that. Who has one major goal in life, which is to fuck up his sister's life, and in a very metal sense, wants to drown her in blood. This sister actually happens to be the deity of one of the other creeds called Davara. One theory is that Azraq is the nameless god on the islands. However, the game wisely does not confirm this. Actually, I go back and forth on whether I think this expedition dump should have happened at all, as I think careful players could surmise much of this information. One of the strengths of the mini-series that Salt and Sanctuary draws from is the ambiguous lore, which leaves plenty of room for the imagination. Anyway, while the Still Palace has unique and interesting visual design, it's pretty empty. Which on one hand really sets up the action of the final boss fight quite nicely, but on the other hand mechanically just serves as a really long walk to the final boss. The nameless god himself was fairly difficult for me on my first playthrough, although one huge pet peeve I have is the fall damage you're required to take before taking him on. I'm really not a fan of these unavoidable damage tropes in games because it just feels like a cheap shot before what is supposed to be your final duel and challenge in the game. The wiki says the lore justification here is to force you to kneel before the god, but I call absolute BS on this, as there's no way my Guts character, who literally cut his way through deities and monstrosities from various continents and times, and whose creed is the Iron Ones, which, quote, is to bow to no gods or idols, believe instead in the iron will of man, came this f***ing far just to bow before this absolute chump. Okay, rant over. Anyway, he's pretty nimble and has a decent range of physical and magic attacks, which he'll continue extremely aggressively as he rages around the arena. On the downside, he is a bit of a glass cannon though, and he doesn't even have a second stage. And the first time I beat him, I kind of thought, damn, is that it? I mean, this guy literally has God in his title, but I can stagger him with a couple hits. It's just weird. After we take him down, it's just a short and ambient walk where, based on some of our actions and specific creeds, we get one of the various endings and then are immediately booted to New Game Plus. As a first entry into this series, there's some extremely effective world building here, and I appreciate how it's not so in your face, which it very easily could have been. It's a common trap for establishing IPs to hit the player over the head with expedition dumps, and it makes sense. You put a lot of time and effort into the story, and you want people to appreciate it, goddammit. Salt and Sanctuary handles this with a very mature restraint, and although it's very easy to see its influences, I think it works very well for the story that it's trying to tell. Another benefit of this subdued narrative is that it lets players take it at their own pace. For those curious about the world and the situation of the player character, there are enough clues in dialogue and items descriptions. And for those who just want to swing a sword at some monsters and not deal with all that nonsense, you can easily do just that. There's enough nuance in the world building here for your own imagination to fill in the blanks, excitedly drawing connections and patterns between these various cultures and entities. There's enough lore here to literally fill up an entire book. Again, shout out to the Drowned Tomb. The design decision to have the islands of various cultures smashed together is an incredibly inspired one for world building. As a RPG, the story is effective as you can choose your own backstory, gameplay, and ending. You really feel like this is your story, which is great. Now, I'm a huge fan of smashing random genres together into some new Frankenstein-esque monstrosity, so take this with a grain of salt, eh? But these elements, Dark Souls, Game of Thrones, Lovecraftian, Metroidvanias, Although by no means original, they come together mostly successfully, and I would say it culminates into something unique and with its own voice. The world, the story, and the characters that inhabit it have an odd charm despite the game's extremely dark and oppressive themes, and there's hope and humanity here within the darkness. One of the core mechanics that may be the beating heart of the game itself is the combat. It's surprisingly visceral for a 2D game, with the sounds and the gore really adding this much needed crunch and weight to it. I honestly wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. The mechanics here, although they can feel fast and desperate at times, actually reward a methodical, patient, and calm playing style. I noticed the more frustrated I became at a boss or encounter, the worse I would actually perform, leading to this awful negative feedback loop where presumably my neighbors still hear my howls and shrieks in their nightmares. Wind-ups do exist similar to Dark Souls, but attacks even from larger weapons and spells are actually pretty quick. Things really feel very fluid, and this has helped a lot with the different combos available to the various weapon types. And although they are somewhat limited, I think they do get the job done. That being said, for the most part, what you get from the start is most likely what you're going to end with as far as movesets and powers. Nothing is really changing as you progress through the game, which is a little bit of a missed opportunity, you know? In my opinion, and this is a very, very humble opinion, Salt and Sanctuary might have been taking too many notes from Dark Souls and not enough from Metroidvanias. In combat, particularly the boss battles, this is evident in the lack of vertical and upward mobility your character has. Take Hollow Knight, for example, and I know that's a somewhat unfair comparison because it came out after, but still, you can zip around midair, stop, attack above or below, and at any given moment, you just have a ton of mobility with your attack options available to you. Now, if we compare this to Salt and Sanctuary, we feel kind of like a beached whale. Our only real combat options are viable while fighting on the ground, and by virtue of that, much of the vertical space that the 2D genre allows for is completely wasted. All that's to say, I cannot tell you how much this impacts combat, and in particular, boss designs. So, for example, not only are we the players limited to only really horizontal movements and not vertical, but also most of the bosses are as well. Only a handful of bosses fly and zip around the arena, and these honestly feel so frustrating because oftentimes we can't really keep up with them. Level and boss designs are determined by what the player character is capable of, and because our options are so limited, the boss mechanics become equally as limited, and this really begins to show as the game goes on. A poor man's solution to this might just be to cut the number of bosses. In many areas there are back-to-back bosses, and some of these could easily have been cut, and focus could have been implemented on a fewer number of more memorable bosses rather than quantity. Criticisms aside, the visual and lore designs of the bosses are just so cool, and as I mentioned previously, I was really impressed with how many unique combat designs they managed to get in given the amount of limitations. They absolutely achieved their goal of bosses as spectacles, down to the little title cards of the bosses that display on screen before a battle. Speaking of self-imposed limitations, I was also shocked that none of the bosses really have second phases. It seems like such a staple of Souls series and also Metroidvanias as well. Another notable missed opportunity was the lack of any player-sized dual-type bosses. This seemed like an obvious inclusion for the game, and I wonder why the devs would exclude it. Actually, the closest the game comes is when desecrating a sanctuary, you're forced to fight all of the merchant NPCs in the area, and judging from their AI, maybe it wasn't dynamic or nimble enough to offer up a real challenge. Actually, instead of scaling down, the preference seemed to have been to scale up, with the bosses just getting bigger and bigger. Although bosses do seem to change their movesets as fight progresses, it's nothing nearly as dramatic as something like your Ornstein and Smough. As for basic enemies, there are a surprisingly large amount of models, even if most of them are simple reskins. When it comes down to mechanics, there are only really a few archetypes, although there are a smattering of more unique enemies with varying degrees of success, such as the floating eye enemies that make other guys invincible and the hanged men. There are a few enemy types that display a surprisingly large misunderstanding of the core game's mechanics. I've already mentioned the teleporting skeleton boys, the poison blobs, and the hanged men, and you get the impression that if this baby had more time to cook with playtest, these rough parts might have been fixed. It is nice how there is a glossary for the enemies, and effort has been made for each of their stories to tie in narratively to the locations we find them in. Most enemies hit hard, but also get hit hard, forcing you to pay attention even on high levels. Overall, I think they achieve their purpose of adding road bumps and atmosphere to the level segments, even if some of the gameplay ideas just miss the mark. Most of the enemies and bosses are fairly forgiving and easy enough to get through and don't overstay their welcome. However, this could greatly depend on your builds and playstyles, and I've skirted around this issue for the entire video, but we have got to talk about the builds here. The team that made Salt and Sanctuary was very small, and for the amount the game tries to achieve, there is understandably some areas that might not have gotten the attention that they deserve. So what I'm saying is the builds are just not balanced. Strength and magic builds in particular are so OP. They hit extremely hard and fast, and add on top of that, the speed at which you can level is extraordinarily quick. If you distribute your stats correctly, high-level bosses will take huge amounts of damage from you even if you don't try to grind for levels necessarily. Now, my Strength Greatsword Guts character just so happened to be my first playthrough, so I had a very skewed perspective on the difficulty compared to my second Dex playthrough. I mean, at times it honestly felt like two different games, and I'm honestly conflicted on if that's a bad thing or not, but it's definitely notable. It is commendable though, the amount of options and builds there are here. Pistols, bows, spears, clerics, whips, and when you see it you think, wow, this is amazing, I can't wait to try some of these. And then you do, and you realize nothing is as good as your big old sword. Again, this is another area where maybe instead of quantity, they could have focused more on quality. Take Bloodborne for example. You have far less weapons than Dark Souls, but each weapon is unique and for the most part viable. Now, you could make an argument that as a single player game, the entire notion of balance doesn't really matter, and I would say, true, that makes sense. But I can see how this could potentially lead to some very frustrating situations for a new player. Let's take Skyrim or Oblivion for example, where it's also possible to completely full whoopsie your character. At least there you have a difficulty slider, so if worse comes to worse, new players can progress, but in Salt and Sanctuary, you don't have this, so if you have a not great build, you can be in for a very rough time, and then even worse, some new players might not even understand where they're going wrong, and then even worse than that, they don't really have recourse, since you can't really equip other weapon types if you don't have the correct stats. So, all that's to say, difficulty and challenge are central tenets in this game, and having the player build be such a pivotal role in this could be problematic and frustrating to some players, especially those new to the genre, as they can unintentionally f themselves with the builds. Another component of the build issue is the encumbrance mechanic. Now, if you're familiar with Dark Souls, it works almost the exact same. Every item has a certain weight, and the more weight you wear, the slower you move and the slower you roll. You could compensate for this lack of mobility by utilizing an enormous shield, and this seems perfectly viable, even more viable than in some Soulsborne games. The issue with the encumbrance is that this is a 2D game that emphasizes platforming in many sections. Since your weight affects your roll and jump speed, I can see how some people have some big issues here. Speaking of builds and similar systems to Dark Souls, magic is one area I was surprised that they deviated from Soulsborne mechanics. Instead of a separate magic meter or a certain amount of uses, magic is instead tied to your stamina, and the more you use spells, the less stamina you have access to. There are ways for you to replenish it, and overall it feels like a more forgiving and easy to spam system. Actually, surprisingly, in interviews, Silvas admitted that Magic is kind of an easy mode, and attempting to find a way to nerf it was a bit of a challenge. That being said, it can take a bit of time and patience for a Magic build to get going, but once you do, boy oh boy. They hit like trucks and they got some range, baby, and most bosses just cannot deal. There are a decent amount of spells and spell archetypes here, with some that are even secret or easy to miss, and a lot of items and metagaming you can do to min-max these builds. It did feel like a much different world and ecosystem than my melee character, which was a nice change. Now, builds aside, and I know this depends a lot from person to person, but personally, I don't think the difficulty was too extreme. I know, shoot me. I think there was effort made here to make it manageable though, for the most part. For example, I think there were always sanctuaries or shortcuts nearby, and most walks were actually quite forgiving. Another example of this is the aforementioned splitting of the currencies, with gold and salt being two separate currencies, and you do get to at least keep your gold, albeit with a fine after each death. Tying into difficulty is the health and stamina mechanics. I've already mentioned the stamina, but health works in a similar way, where the more damage you take, the less overall health you have access to with healing items. One downside of this mechanic and the game's tendency to not hold your hands or explain things is that I had literally no idea why this wounding mechanic was happening until pretty much the end of my first playthrough. That being said, I did feel like the healing options were actually pretty forgiving. The healing items fill a ton of health. Like, I can't stress how much the standard healing items heal. There would be times where I would be at low health and a boss would hit me with a massive attack right after I healed, and not only would I survive, but my health would actually be completely full. If that's not enough, then you also have these little blood vials which can serve as nice backups. One area that I did find difficult for all the wrong reasons was the goddamn darkness. Now listen, I understand this game is supposed to be dark and oppressive and hopeless, but come on, man, some of these areas are just so absurd, and I feel like I have a pretty high tolerance for things like this. The game constantly reminded me of this too, because the levels always somehow manage to get progressively darker and darker. The real problem here is the lack of the goddamn brightness setting, which is just so confusing why it's absent. All I can say is RIP to anyone who's ever tried to play this on Switch on a sunny day. There is a multiplayer mechanic here, and it's nicely tied into the game world in a bit more intuitive way than in your Dark Souls. That being said, I didn't really get a chance to play around with it that much, mostly because I have no friends, but it seems like people enjoyed it, and it's always nice to have this as an option, especially in a game already as ambitious as this. It's just kind of the icing on the cake. Another key component of this game is the Metroidvania aspects. Now, I hate the entire idea of genres in general, and saying Soulsborne this many times on the internet makes me want to call all my exes and tell them, fine, you're right, I'm a failure, please take me back. But in this case, it's unavoidable, and it's useful for us to have a common idea and vision for us to reference. So, just so we're all on the same page here, I want to be very clear about how I define a Metroidvania.
The gameplay of a Metroidvania typically features a large interconnected world, with areas that are initially inaccessible until the player acquires new abilities or items. You must explore the environment, find power-ups, complete platforming segments, and defeat enemies in order to progress through the game.
Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's break these down one by one. As for the platforming, it's not great, and at the worst of times, to me, it felt like a bit of an afterthought. Climbing and edge detection can be a bit finicky, and I felt like probably 80% of my deaths were a result of falls. These problems are exasperated when you have to deal with combat while platforming, especially against the enemies I mentioned that kind of fly across the map. The root of the issue here is the mobility options we have. They just don't really increase that significantly until the very end of the game, and even when they do, they just don't feel that tight to control. That brings me to number 2, which is power-ups. I've touched on this before, but the power-ups most of the time just don't feel that substantial or used nearly enough. Sure, there are some secret areas that can be accessed if you backtrack, and that's fine, but I just have to hammer home one more time the missed opportunity of not tying these power-ups to combat in a significant way, and this contributes a lot to the platforming issue as well. It's really interesting to compare this to the likes of Hollow Knight, which utilizes new abilities both in navigation and in combat. In Salt and Sanctuary, you just get the feeling that the verticality which 2D games allow aren't really explored, so for most combat you're just on the ground dodging or blocking, which results in a very repetitive feeling toward the end of the game. The other aspect of Metroidvanias is the interconnected worlds, and yes, I will give this to Salt and Sanctuary here. It does feel smashed together in all the right ways, and actually, my first playthrough, I didn't even realize you could fast travel. It's a testament to the world design that I never felt too far from anything during that no fast travel playthrough, and I was always pleasantly surprised to find myself looping back into old areas. Speaking of fast travel, it's a pretty nice system here, and once I finally realized how it works, you're able to get around pretty much anywhere extraordinarily quickly, for better or worse, depending on your take on fast travel systems. The world also feels massive thanks to all the secret areas. I mean, not only are there areas that are only accessible through certain upgrades that you can completely miss on your first playthrough, like Miles' Floating Castle, there are also hidden doorways scattered around as well, which is great and had me pushing buttons near almost every inconspicuous wall I came across. Another thing that contributes to this gigantic feel of the world is that it's entirely non-linear, and if you're getting crushed in one section, you can always turn around and probably find another level to go through. On the downside of traversal, there's no map here. I mean, listen, I know they didn't have a map in Dark Souls, but a 2D Metroidvania without a map, it's just blasphemy. I actually didn't personally mind it too much in most levels, as I found the designs generally were distinct enough with enough landmarks for me to find my way fairly easily. Although this wasn't always the case, and some levels look really similar with that generic dark cave look. Although, if worse comes to worse, you can always look up a map online, and after my first playthrough, I finally did have a look at one, and it's very interesting to see how deep and also how high the map goes and how it all kind of ties together, particularly the upside down sections. Speaking of how massive the world feels and hidden content, another carryover from Dark Souls is the NPC questline system. Again, here you'll encounter various NPCs, each with their own questline throughout your journey on the islands. It's very easy to miss these, and I think I didn't complete a single one on my first playthrough, which is a shame because you're rewarded some pretty rare items for your efforts. Some of these you're pretty much assured to run into at least once as part of the main quest, but oftentimes subsequent meetings require backtracking or going to a certain area at a certain time. These storylines add depth and perspective to the main story, and oftentimes hit surprising emotional tones, and it's crazy how these derpy little faces can evoke any feelings at all. I really felt like the Masterless Knight and Thief were my bros, and I got a little buzz out of stumbling across them and getting some encouraging zingers for my efforts. They really help to humanize the game and give more context to your quest. Leveling plays a key part of progression here, and it's integrated into the Sanctuary and skill tree mechanics. Although the skill tree looks incredibly complex at the offset, as I progressed, I realized that a lot of the skills were actually redundant and a little boring. Most of the skills on the tree are your standard level up strength, /dex, /will, /etc. What's strange here is that these skill perks you can level up multiple times, so the only point to invest in the ones further down the tree is to unlock the other perks those progressions are tied to. The only other types of perks are upgrades to your armor or weapon skill levels, which allow you to use higher class tiers or upgrades to your health or stamina usage numbers. These type of restrictive skill trees and branching paths can come at the cost of new players who may or may not know what type of build they want and end up investing in a ton of points for weapons or stats they may never use. Now, what I mean by restrictive is that in your Dark Souls, there are no weapon skills, only weapon stat requirements. So you go strength, intelligence, or some kind of hybrid, and these could unlock a variety of different weapon types, not just a sword or a pike. This allows for a very distinctive character that has flexibility to switch between different kinds of weapons without having to respec. In SAS, you have to unlock a specific weapon perk to use a weapon type, and sure, there are weapons that have no requirements, but those are often the worst weapons of the bunch, which could turn you off that playstyle completely. And sorry to all my pitchfork and or homies that last comment might have offended. I have nothing but respect for you. Additionally, if there's a specific weapon or a specific tier you want, it's almost inevitable in this system you'll need to invest in some points along the way you may not want or even really need. Now, for both of these issues, there is a solution in the form of the Great Pearls, where you can respec a point, but these are a bit limited and aren't that numerous to completely change your playstyle halfway through the game. So essentially, this skill tree system definitely has the potential to irk two major groups of players here. New players who are just trying to understand their builds and play around with different combat styles, as well as those who want to min-max their characters. On the upside, aesthetically though, it does have to be said that the skill tree looks great, and it's more engaging definitely than just the standard spreadsheet numbers from your Soulsborne, even if it may be less efficient. I think it's a nice detail here that the fact that every single perk has its own little lore quote, which ties into the larger world building. I think the skill tree could be utilized here, and it is an interesting idea, but probably needed more time in the oven to finalize. I have not played or really looked at Salt and Sacrifice, the sequel, and I'd be really curious if they tried another similar system there. On the other end of leveling is the sanctuaries. These are the only places that you can level. In multiple interviews, the devs stated that they wanted to have a contrast in the form of the sanctuaries against the world, where the sanctuaries are safe and healing, and the rest of the world is, quote, trying to suffocate you. I personally didn't feel the world oppression thing on my OP two-handed sword guts run, but I do think this idea was mostly translated well. The fact that you can customize your sanctuaries to a degree is a great addition, and I would personally love to see how this would go in a Soulsborne game. That being said, I did feel like something was missing here. The vendors we get are just generic NPCs, lacking any real connection or secrets or lore to unlock. It felt all very businesslike when I was there at these sanctuaries, and I was usually gone in a matter of minutes, which, I get efficiency is important, don't get me wrong, but I just wish there was something else in here to kind of sink your teeth into. Now, if you are frustrated at the lack of a leveling waifu, you could actually take out your frustrations by defiling the sanctuaries. This was another mechanic I had no idea existed on my first playthrough, and I do wish they hinted a bit more strongly at it, although maybe I'm just a dummy and missed some contextual clues. Actually, I do think this was a larger issue, at least for me, on my first playthrough because I fundamentally misunderstood the importance of a creed and all the benefits you could reap from them. As a brief aside, there are in fact quite a few hidden mechanics in the game that are never really explained, and I'm a bit torn on these. On one hand, that feeling of discovery is great, but can also be super frustrating if you genuinely have no idea why something is happening. Anyway, not only do the visuals and NPCs change based on your creed, but more importantly, the bonus items and merchandise change as well, which can impact your game significantly. I guess my other gripe here is that the more interesting secret creeds come way late and almost at the end of the game unless you are specifically gunning for them. SNS offers a vast array of equipment, over 600 weapons, armor pieces, spells, and items, so you're never really lacking for the ability to customize your character. You can choose from a surprisingly huge range of weapons, greatswords, axes, shields, guns, spells, they got it all. All of these can be upgraded at a blacksmith using salt and special upgrade items as well as currency. Transmuting is an interesting, if not inspired, mechanic where you can upgrade your weapon to any other weapon of the same type, as well as special ones, using materials collected throughout the game. And this system allows for powerful and unique boss items that you're awarded for after defeating the various bosses. Additionally, charms provide a range of benefits such as increased damage, faster stamina regeneration, and improved resistances to certain types of damages, and just offer more flexibility to your builds, which is always great. However, as I was saying in my build section, the game's balancing might have benefited from a bit more polishing in the end, and it feels like most of the items and armors are kind of generic and feel mostly the same aside from raw stats and occasionally some looks. Some epic and unique abilities would have been interesting here. Salt and Sanctuary's tone and aesthetic can best be described as somber and dark, often pushing the boundaries of what some players might consider too dark. The environments are heavily desaturated, which adds to the sense of hopelessness and despair that permeates the game. The visual design can be somewhat muddy, and players may have trouble discerning where their character is actually located, although you can use a torch to help navigate the game's darker environments, although it can be a little tough on the eyes. The graphics take on a drab, watercolor art style that, while charming at first and with occasional moments of real beauty, eventually leads to a feeling of repetition. The liberal usage of darkness and relatively muted color palette means that it doesn't take very long for one area to look no different than the one you just came from. Another downfall of this aesthetic is that things can be very easy to miss, like traps that can take out a huge chunk of your health. On the other side of the aesthetic is the game's music, and for the most part it's excellent, although again somewhat repetitive. In particular, I found the grating guitars used in the soundtrack to be really annoying to me personally. As far as the actual character designs though, I kind of love them, even if they're a little off-putting with that kind of weird derpy face they have. I walked into this game with almost zero expectations, and thinking that it would be a cute little palate cleanser after my last two videos took way more time than I thought, and I could not have been any more wrong. There is a depth and a heart in this, and it's truly amazing how much content the devs packed in here considering just how tiny the team was. The lore, the worlds, the bosses, the equipment have this variety and soul in here that consistently surprised me even when I was on my second playthrough. One could argue that maybe there's a bit too much content and maybe some of the ideas needed to be cut, and things definitely could have been refined more. I do think that some of the worst aspects about this game, the unrealized platform and Metroidvania mechanics, balancing, and some boss and enemy design, they aren't even terrible, they just needed a few tweaks and some more playtesting. That being said, for such an interesting mix of genres and ideas, it's amazing just how much they actually got right. It's unfortunate because I've seen a lot of discourse and reviews around this game, with the pivotal thesis being, does this game stand out from the shadows of Dark Souls? And while this idea can and should be explored, I do personally feel it's a bit derivative to reduce the game down to just another Dark Souls clone, because there's so much more at play here, or at the very least SNS should be viewed as having its own identity. While there are undoubtedly many mechanics and systems here that were borrowed from the Souls series, there are many ideas here that are new, even if these come with varying degrees of success. I've always been fascinated with this idea of smashing different genres together like your favorite toys from different universes. You can't tell me Warhammer 40k plus Lego is not a fucking awesome idea. And this game delivers just that. I think this type of mad scientist combinations is how entirely new genres, subgenres, and mechanics are born, working within the limitations and ideas that force you to come up with entirely new ones. And again, it's extremely admirable that SCA Studios was able to stick the landing on so much for their first run at this. Would I recommend this? That's a bit of a tough question. There is definitely an audience here, but I guess I'm not even really sure who that audience is. I mean, or what they're called. Maybe Catboys? I stick by my statement where I can definitely see this game alienating some key demographics, namely those new to Soulsborne genres, as well as die-hard fans of Soulsborne genres who enjoy min-maxing. I personally really enjoyed my time with it, even after multiple runs for this analysis, and I can absolutely see myself coming back and trying like an aura-only build, and I don't even like side-scrollers. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't fucking know if you should try it. Did you watch this whole thing? Did it seem interesting? Well, get out there and play it. It's like less than $12. I don't know. If you don't feel it, feel free to deface your shrine to me. I don't care anymore. No, but seriously, if you watch this, thank you so much. This is my third video ever, and I really thought they get like easier and less time consuming. But yeah, wow, they take a long time to make. It kills me to say this, but if you drop a like or sub, thank you. It really helps me to get this thing off the ground and make more videos like it. I do have an itch to go back to another strategy game after this one, but if you guys have any suggestions on what you'd like me to cover, please let me know. All right, take it easy. Bye. See you later. Okay, yep, that's it.